Breaking today, the CEO of UnitedHealthCare, Brian Thompson, was shot and killed outside a hotel in Midtown Manhattan early Wednesday morning. New York police say it's unclear why Thompson was shot. The NYPD commissioner called the shooting a brazen, targeted attack and said the suspect was lying in wait for several minutes. Right now, police are still looking for the shooter. Police describe him as a light-skinned man wearing a light brown or cream-colored jacket, black face mask, and a very distinctive gray backpack. Police say the shooter fled on foot, then picked up a city bike that he rode into Central Park. They are offering a $10,000 reward for information. Following the shooting, the United Health Group released a statement that reads in part, quote, "We are deeply saddened and shocked at the passing of our dear friend and colleague Brian Thompson. Brian was a highly respected colleague and a friend to all who worked with him. Our hearts go out to Brian's family and all who were close to him." Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, says he won't back down amid controversy over allegations of sexual misconduct, alcohol abuse, and financial mismanagement. A 2018 email written by Hegseth's mother accusing him of mistreating women for years was published last week by the New York Times. Penelope Hegseth appeared on Fox News this morning to defend her son. Take a listen.
I am here to tell the truth to the American people, and tell the truth to the senators on the Hill, especially our female senators. I really hope that you will not listen to the media and that you will listen to Pete.
She also said she wrote the email with deep emotions and retracted it with an apology 2 hours later. Joining us to discuss this and more, Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Now, Hegseth is meeting with senators today, including Republican Joni Ernst from Iowa. She's seen as an important voice for women in the military. We also heard from Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut today. Let's listen to that and then talk about it on the other side.
Almost anyone would be better than Hegseth, and my prediction is we won't be talking about him by Monday. I think that he's going to be facing so much pressure to withdraw from Republicans as well as Democrats. He could end his nomination by the end of the day.
There are Republican senators that have come out in support of Hegseth after their meetings with him. How important are these meetings with senators?
They are vitally important in and of themselves. Obviously, Pete Hegseth could, at least in theory, quiet some of these concerns. But I do think his nomination really is teetering, Drew. I mean, the indications that we're getting are that he's in trouble. The Wall Street Journal had a report about President-elect Trump considering supplanting him with Ron DeSantis as his pick for Defense Secretary. All of the signs here are pretty bad for Pete Hegseth. Could he turn it around? Maybe, but I think his chances of being confirmed are less than 50-50 at this point.
Well, Hegseth says Trump told him to keep fighting, but we're also hearing kind of leaks from within the transition team that Hegseth wasn't honest about the problems that he could face. How should we interpret what we're hearing in these reports from what's being said inside the Trump transition team?
I think really those are smoke signals about dissatisfaction within the Trump transition team. The things that you mentioned and the suggestion of Ron DeSantis as a replacement nominee, all those are indicators that the Trump camp isn't happy. And I think with Pete Hegseth, the key point is now this isn't just one allegation. Previously it had been. There had been a murky allegation of sexual assault that he had denied. Now there is the makings of a pattern of behavior or pattern of alleged behavior. That's where the real danger lies.
Trump has another administration official pick, Peter Navarro, to serve as the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing. Navarro was the White House trade advisor during the first Trump administration, subsequently served 4 months in prison for failing to comply with a congressional subpoena related to the January 6th investigation. Wonder what message this sends about the Trump Part 2. You know, I read it as he's serious about tariffs.
I think he's serious about getting people who have shown loyalty to him around him. And I think that's one of the big distinguishing lines from the first Trump term. In the first term, there was almost, in a way, a kind of coalition government with the MAGA people and the conventional Republicans. Peter Navarro is not a conventional Republican, much more protectionist, much more hawkish on China. And to your point, I think that feeds into the greater seriousness on the tariff question.
want to ask you about Chad Chronister. He was Trump's nominee for DEA. He's the sheriff of Hillsborough County, which includes Tampa, Florida. It's in Florida. He was criticized by the right over his enforcement during COVID times, including the arrest of this pastor that wasn't complying with some of the rules that have been handed down. Chronister said that he realized the gravity of the responsibility. I'm wondering, do you think him declining to further pursue this is a recognition of the seriousness and the gravity of the job, or because of pressure from the right?
I think it's more the former than the latter. Now, you're right that there was criticism from the right, and even now the COVID lockdowns and everything around them is a very hot button issue. But to me, that criticism that you allude to didn't really reach the level where it would have derailed his nomination on its own. To my mind, for whatever reason, he has made the decision that he doesn't really want the hassle, never mind the scrutiny. And unless there's some other shoe to drop, that's what I interpret his move to me.
Experienced law enforcement officer, but maybe not necessarily the geopolitical experience required of that job. Senator Mitch McConnell, former Republican Senate Majority Leader, is crying foul after these two federal judges decided to rescind their decisions to retire. Both of them were appointed by Democratic presidents. McConnell says this is a partisan attempt to prevent Trump from appointing replacements once he comes into power. Dems have made confirming judges a major goal for them in this lame duck session while Biden is still in power. Why is that? Why is the fight over judges so important as Democrats leave office and Republicans take full control of power in Washington?
I think because judges don't only decide the criminality or otherwise in a particular given case, the judiciary is itself absolutely central to deciding some of the most divisive or polarizing issues in American life. And yes, that process culminates at the Supreme Court, but those kind of issues can still be ruled upon in lower courts on their way up the ladder. And so judges have an enormous amount of influence on some of the big cultural questions. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is now such a pitched battle, these two Democratic appointed judges deciding to rescind their imagined or expected resignation.
It seems like they can slow down or speed up cases sometimes, as we saw with the prosecutions of Trump, that some of the judges' decisions really slowed down those cases. Right. The reasoning behind that we'll leave to others to debate. A jury in New York is deliberating the fate of Daniel Penny. He is an ex-Marine charged in the death of this man, Jordan Neely. It happened on a subway in New York City in 2023. Neely was a homeless black man. Penny is a white ex-Marine. He intervened in this case, applied a chokehold. Neely later died after the altercation. This was one of those big culture war stories that provoked this raw emotions, has tie-ins with race, big city crime problems, homelessness. I wonder, as we go into the Trump administration, what do you make of the state of the culture wars?
I think culture wars are still burning pretty hot, and I think you see that in the Daniel Penny case, which is emblematic of two completely different things, depending whether you're viewing it from a conservative perspective or a liberal perspective. Conservatives believing that this man stood up for his fellow passengers, liberals believing it was essentially vigilantism. There's a very stark divide there, and I think that is reflective or emblematic of the larger cultural divides.
Let's head overseas, talk a little bit about South Korea. Their President Yoon Suk-yeol is facing increasing pressure to resign after Yoon imposed martial law on Tuesday. He rescinded it just 6 hours later, but now opposition lawmakers have filed a motion to impeach. I wonder if you think this crisis will stay within the South Korean borders, or does this have broader implications? Obviously, there's always a fraught relationship between North and South Korea. Containment of North Korea will be a top priority of the second Trump term, but so much has changed in that arena with North Korea becoming involved in Ukraine. What do you make of this situation? How it will apply to geopolitics in the region?
So first of all, I think it was obviously a massive miscalculation by President Yoon to start off with. I think its bigger ramification is whether it leads to further instability in South Korea. That's really where the American interest lies, in ensuring you have a fairly stable South Korea as a counterweight to North Korea. I don't think we know exactly how that plays out yet, but that seems to me the key factor in determining its sort of broader implications.
It'll be interesting to watch Trump's outreach to North Korea and see if we can have any of those high-profile summits or anything like that, but we'll save that for later. Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill, thanks so much for coming on. Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments over transgender rights. The case, which made its way in front of the justices, is the Biden administration's challenge to a Tennessee law that bans gender-affirming care for minors. More than 24 states currently have laws enacted that restrict or ban puberty blockers and other treatments for minors. Let's check in with the Hill's court and legal reporter Zach Schoenfeld, who was inside the Supreme Court today. Zach, the Supreme Court's conservative majority seems skeptical of the challenge to Tennessee's ban. What are the justices questioning?
Yes, so the main issue in this case is the Biden administration's argument that this law in Tennessee that restricts gender-affirming care for minors amounts to unconstitutional sex discrimination. If the justices were to agree with that proposition, it would subject the law to an increased level of scrutiny, and when other courts and other cases that are not at the Supreme Court have applied that level of scrutiny, they have actually struck down similar laws to the one in Tennessee. So that is really the ballgame in this case, but as you were mentioning, the Supreme Court today seems skeptical of that. We saw a number of the conservative justices really posing a lot of hostile questions to both an attorney from the Biden administration as well as an attorney for a group of transgender teens that have also challenged this law. So a decision is still not expected until next summer, so we'll have to wait and see exactly what they do. But certainly coming out of these marathon arguments stretching more than 2 hours, they seem inclined to uphold this law.
Now, the U.S. Solicitor General, who represents the Biden administration, was the first to face the justices. What were her arguments in the courtroom?
The Biden administration has really zeroed in here on many medical organizations that have taken positions on gender-affirming care for minors, finding that for some adolescents it is not only safe but can be medically necessary. But we saw several conservative justices really taking issue with that assertion. In fact, they actually tended to find an unlikely ally, not here in the United States, but across the pond in Europe, where there have been several countries who have recently moved to restrict some types of this care. So you saw in particular Justice Samuel Alito, one of the court's leading conservatives, repeatedly referencing some of these cases that have come up in Europe, saying that maybe that should give the court here in the U.S. Pause and instead leave this in the hand of democratically elected representatives rather than the 9 justices here on the Supreme Court.
What about from the state of Tennessee? What did we hear from them?
Well, as I mentioned, the argument in this challenge is that this law amounts to unconstitutional sex discrimination. Tennessee has rejected that notion. Instead, they say that this is simply restricting the medical purpose of these treatments. The analogy that we heard from Tennessee's lawyer when he got up to the lectern to begin his argument is he made a reference to morphine, noting that doctors can prescribe morphine to assist patients with pain, but it, for example, cannot be used to assist someone in suicide. And so they said that the same analogy applies here, where although these treatments like puberty blockers and hormones might be okay in some cases when we're not talking about transgender youth, for example, in some cases it's been used to actually as a form of cancer treatment, but they say that the purpose of helping these transgender youth live in alignment with their gender identity shouldn't be allowed.
And this case could have pretty broad implications. What is at stake with this case?
Well, what's at stake here is not only this law in Tennessee, but also this wave of similar laws that we've seen passed by Republican-led legislatures across the country. All of these laws are new, taking place and being passed by legislatures in roughly the last 3 or 4 years or so, beginning in Arkansas and then spreading to Tennessee and other places. So as we stand here today, about half the country right now has similar laws in place. So the Supreme Court's decision is standing to impact not only Tennessee's law, but all of these other laws that are across the country.
There's been a lot of talk of Justice Gorsuch and his silence during the hearing today. What do you make of that, and why are people following that so closely?
Yeah, his silence was really striking and interesting because of the fact that a lot of LGBTQ advocates were watching to see what Justice Gorsuch specifically would say during this argument. And that's because despite the Supreme Court's conservative majority, only a few years ago, we actually saw Justice Gorsuch, who was Donald Trump's first appointee to the court, side with LGBTQ advocates. Now, that case was a little bit different. It had to do with the Civil Rights Act and whether employees can be fired under the Civil Rights Act because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. identity. The Biden administration has argued that the same sort of reasoning applies to this case, even though it's a little bit different. And so there were a lot of eyes on whether Justice Gorsuch would similarly be an ally for LGBTQ advocates in this case. But as you mentioned in the question, we did not hear a single word from Justice Gorsuch today. He did not ask a question to any of the lawyers on any of the sides. I was about 15 or so feet away from him in the courtroom this morning. He spent most of the time with his glasses on, looking down at the briefs in front of him and simply observing the arguments. So we'll have to wait and see until this decision comes out about where he lands.
Yeah, and decision expected this summer. We'll continue to follow. Zach Schoenfeld, court and legal reporter here at The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Drew.
Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has been ordered to turn over any communications she may have had with Special Counsel Jack Smith or the House January 6th committee to a conservative watchdog group. A judge handed down the order nearly 9 months after the group filed suit against the Georgia prosecutor in charge of Trump's election interference case in the state. The group accused Willis of not responding to records requests, but she says she was never properly served. She has been ordered to produce any relevant records and pay attorney fees. Willis has been criticized for her handling of Trump's case after she had an affair with Nathan Wade, the man she hired to be in charge of the prosecution. Earlier this year, a judge ordered that either she or Wade must be removed from the case before proceeding. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.